Somewhere in rural Quebec, a farmer once built an entire house out of stacked firewood. Not logs, not lumber, firewood. Round pieces of wood, the same stuff you would burn in a stove, laid on their sides and mortared together like bricks. That house is still standing, and it is warmer than most homes built last year. Today we are breaking down the stovewood tiny house, also called Cordwood construction, and by the end of this video you're going to know the real 2026 cost per square foot, the actual our value nobody agrees on, the one mistake that turned a forever home into a moldy disaster inside 5 years, and a life cycle number near the end that changes how you should think about this entire building method. Before we get into it, hit subscribe because we cover a different tiny home style like this every single week. And if you're even a little bit serious about building something with your own hands, you do not want to miss the rest of this channel. Now let us get into it. Cordwood construction goes by a lot of names. Cordwood masonry, stack wall, log, and construction, stovewood. All of them describe the same basic idea. You take short rounds of debarked, dried wood, usually cedar, pine, or spruce, and you lay them into a bed of mortar the same way a mason lays brick, except the wood is turned so the round end faces outward. The wall ends up looking like a cross-section of a wood pile, which is exactly where the nickname comes from. The technique is not new. It has roots going back centuries in Eastern Europe and Scandinavia, and it took hold hard in Quebec and the northern United States, where settlers had two things in abundance and almost no money for anything else: trees and time. If you had a woodlet and a strong back, you could build a house without ever visiting a lumberyard. Some of those original stovewood farmhouses from the late 1800s are still standing in Wisconsin and Ontario today, over 100 years later, which tells you something important right out of the gate. This method was never a gimmick. It was a working-class solution to a real problem, and it outlasted the people who built it. The modern revival of this method is largely credited to one man, Rob Roy, who built his first cordwood home in upstate New York in the 1970s and has spent decades since teaching the technique through his Wood building school. Almost every serious modern resource on cordwood, including most of the numbers in this video, traces back to his decades of documented, lived research. He did not just write a book about this method. He has been living inside the results of it since the 70s, in a climate as harsh as Montreal, which is exactly why his numbers carry weight. Here is what most videos on this topic get wrong. They show you a pretty wall and call insulation. A real cordwood wall is a system, not just stacked wood. You pour an inner mortar joint, then a middle cavity, then an outer mortar joint, and that middle cavity is where the actual insulation lives. Most builders fill it with a mix of sawdust and lime, roughly 12 parts sawdust to 1 part lime, soaked and packed in. Some builders use loose perlite or vermiculite instead. The wood itself is not the primary insulator. The cavity is. Wall thickness typically runs between 12 and 24 inches, and that thickness is doing double duty. It is giving you thermal mass from the wood and mortar, and it is giving you an insulated core from the cavity fill. Those are two different jobs, and confusing them is where a lot of the online arguments about cordwood come from. This triple pass system, inner mortar joint, insulated cavity, outer mortar joint, is the exact standard that every credible cordwood builder uses. And if a video shows you a solid wall of wood with no visible cavity, you're looking at a decorative feature wall, not a functioning exterior envelope. If this kind of detail is useful to you, this is exactly the level we go into on every video on this channel. So make sure you're subscribed before we get to the part everybody actually searches for, which is what this thing actually costs to build in 2026 and how warm it actually keeps you. You will find wildly different are value claims for cordwood walls, and almost none of them agree, because people are measuring different things. Wood is what is called anisotropic, meaning it insulates differently depending on which direction heat is moving through it relative to the grain. In a stud wall, heat moves across the grain, and cedar their tests around are 1.25 per inch. But in a cordwood wall, the log ends are facing you, so heat moves parallel to the grain straight through the growth rings. In that direction, the same wood only performs at roughly 40% of that value, closer towards 0.5 per inch. That is not a small difference. That is a drop of about 60% in thermal resistance, just from the orientation of the wood, and almost nobody explains this on camera. That is the part most builders leave out of their pitch. The wood rounds themselves are a mediocre insulator in this orientation. The real performance comes from the insulated cavity between the mortar joints. The only real independent lab testing on this came out of the University of Manitoba, where researchers placed thermal sensors inside a 24-inch thick cordwood wall through a full winter in 2005. Their measured result was an RSI of 6.23, which translates to roughly R35 for that wall system, factoring in the log ends, the mortar, and the sawdust and lime insulation together as one assembly. That works out to about R1.47 per inch across the entire wall, wood and cavity combined. Separately, Rob Roy's own 16-inch cedar cordwood home in upstate New York, in a climate as cold as Montreal, tests out around R22 for the insulated mortar portion, enough to meet New York State's energy code on its own, before you even factor in the thermal mass benefit. So here's the honest answer. A well-built cordwood wall in the 16 to 24-inch range can land anywhere between R20 and R35, depending on cavity fill and construction quality. That is a genuinely competitive number, better than a standard 2x6 stud wall, but it depends entirely on execution, and a poorly packed cavity will underperform badly. This is not a method where you can eyeball the insulation and hope for the best. The number on paper only shows up in the wall if you pack that cavity correctly every single course all the way around the building. Our value is not the whole story, and this is the part that gets skipped constantly. Cordwood walls carry real thermal mass, more than a stud frame wall, though less than solid brick or stone. That mass absorbs heat during the day and slowly releases it at night, which smooths out temperature swings instead of letting your tiny home spike hot and cold the way a lightly insulated frame structure does. It will not replace insulation, but paired with good insulation, it is a genuine comfort advantage, especially if you're pairing the build with passive solar orientation, meaning you're putting your glass on the side that catches winter sun and letting these heavy walls soak that heat up and release it slowly through the night. Now the number you came for. Complete cordwood home builds in 2026 are running in the range of $50 to $100 per square foot, all in, foundation, roofing, and finishes included. Compare that to a conventional stick frame tiny home this year, which nationally averages $150 to $350 per square foot or more, depending on finishes and region. If you are comparing cordwood specifically against a basic, no-frills stick frame self-build, $150 to $200 per square foot is the fair baseline, and even against that lower number, cordwood is still running at roughly a third to half the cost. Against the higher end of the conventional market, the gap becomes even more dramatic, and it widens further the more of your own wood you are willing to source. Material costs for the wall system itself can run as low as $5 to $10 per square foot when you're using scrap wood, downed trees, or timber harvested right off your own land. Rob Roy has documented builds where a small cabin, right around 25 square meters, went up for about $5,000 total, which works out to somewhere around $15 to $20 per square foot. That number assumes you already have access to wood, and you're trading your own labor for cash savings, which is the entire premise of this build method. Labor is the other side of that coin. Specialized cordwood masons, on the rare occasion you can find one, charge somewhere between $20 and $40 an hour. But most cordwood homes in North America are still owner-built, because contractors who know this method properly are genuinely hard to find. That is not a downside if you're the kind of person watching this channel. That is the entire appeal. Set that against the broader 2026 tiny home market. The national average for a fully built tiny home this year sits between $30,000 and $95,000, with most people landing around $60,000 for something turnkey and finished. A DIY cordwood build, using salvaged wood in your own two hands, can realistically undercut that number by a wide margin, especially once you get past 400 square feet, where per square foot savings really start compounding. On a small 400 square foot cordwood tiny home, that is the difference between a build that could land in the $20,000 to $40,000 range for materials and site work versus a comparable turnkey stick frame home pushing $60,000 to $90,000 for the same footprint. Here is what almost nobody puts in their Cordwood video, and it is the reason some of these builds fail. Moisture management is not optional, it is the entire game, which shrinks as it dries and cures inside the wall, which means every cordwood wall develops small gaps around the log ends over time. Builders manage this with flexible caulking called chinking, generous roof overhangs to keep rain off the wall face, and a high foundation to keep splashback away from the wood. Skip any of those three details, and you're looking at rot and mold working into the wall from the inside out, sometimes years before it becomes visible from the outside. This is also why climate matters so much with this method. Humid, high rainfall regions, especially the American Southeast, put far more moisture pressure on a cordwood wall than a dry, cold climate does, because the wood never fully dries between rain events, and that constant moisture cycling is what invites rot. This is a major reason cordwood took hold historically in places like Quebec and the upper Midwest, where winters are brutal but dry, rather than the Gulf Coast, where summers are hot and soaked. If you're building in a high humidity region, you're not disqualified, but you need tighter chinking maintenance, deeper overhangs, and a builder or minter who has specifically dealt with cordwood in wet conditions, not someone who only has cold climate experience. Permitting is the other honest challenge, and it deserves a straight answer instead of a vague one. Cordwood does not have a dedicated section in the International Residential Code. What that means practically is that your local building department will typically process it under Section R104.11, the Alternative Materials and Methods provision, which allows a building official to approve a construction method that is not explicitly covered in the code, provided you can demonstrate it meets the intent of the code for strength, durability, and fire and moisture resistance. In practice, that usually means submitting engineering documentation on your specific wall assembly, and sometimes getting a stamp from a structural engineer before your permit gets approved. In counties that have seen cordwood before, this is routine paperwork. In counties that have never seen it, expect a longer approval process, more questions, and possibly a fight with an official who has simply never signed off on a wall like this. Rural areas with lighter code enforcement remain the easiest path, which lines up with where this method has historically thrived, but do not assume you can skip this step. Building without a permit on a structure using an alternative method is a much bigger risk than doing the same thing with conventional framing. Because if anything ever goes wrong, there is no standard code section backing up how the wall was built. Labor hours matter here more than almost any other tiny home style, because you are essentially hand-laying every wall like a mason, one round at a time. A basic DIY tiny home built across any method typically eats between 800 and 2,000 hours of skilled labor, and cordwood tends to sit on the higher end of that range because of how slow the stacking and mortaring process is compared to framing with dimensional lumber. Think about what that actually means in practice. A solo builder is not just placing wood. They are cutting and drying rounds, mixing mortar in small batches so it does not set up before it is used, packing insulation into a cavity by hand, course after course, and doing it slowly enough that the wall stays structurally sound as it cures. This is not a weekend project. Most owner-builders spread a cordwood tiny home across 1 to 2 full building seasons, working around weather, mortar cure times, and with drying schedules, and that timeline only gets longer if you are harvesting and seasoning your own wood from scratch rather than buying pre-dried rounds. If you have access to standing timber, a woodlet, or even a steady supply of scrap and down trees, and you have more time and money, cordwood remains one of the cheapest ways to put a genuinely well-insulated, thermally stable structure on your land. If you're trying to build fast in a wet climate without hands-on experience, or in a county that has never permitted this method before, you're signing up for a much harder road than a standard frame tiny home. This method rewards patience and punishes shortcuts, and that is true in both directions, financially and structurally. And here is the number that changes how most people think about this whole method. Once you run the full life cycle cost, not just the build cost, but 50 years of heating and cooling on top of it, cordwood walls have historically come out ahead of standard framed walls in life cycle cost studies, because the thermal mass and cavity insulation combination cuts heating costs enough over decades to offset the slower, more labor-intensive build process. In other words, the sticker price is not even the real advantage. The real advantage shows up on your heating bill every single winter for the rest of the time the house stands, and given that properly built cordwood homes from the early 20th century are still occupied and functioning today, over 100 years after they went up, that could be a very, very long time to keep collecting on that investment. If you found this breakdown useful, subscribe for the next one, because next week we're tearing apart another historic building style and turning it into a tiny home blueprint you can actually use. See you in the next video.